Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Catherine Wygant Fawcett, the Executive Director of IFOB, Institute for Family-Owned Business. We have Brooke Stewart, our Director of Communications, joining us, and Andrea Parker-Michaud, our Sales and Marketing Coordinator. Thank you to PretiFlaherty and Maine Biz for sponsoring us today. We've muted everyone, and in a minute we'll ask everybody to take their videos off so we just get to see our lovely presenters. We'll be recording the program for later viewing. We'll also share all the slides and any resources that we have. And we want to make sure this is interactive. So please send me any questions in the chat and I will break in and we'll chat with Laura and Deb. And you can do that throughout the presentation. And then, as many of you know, the IFOB is a nonprofit that helps family businesses succeed. We offered over 60 programs this year, both online, in person, and hybrid. We work with CEOs, we work with women in family business, the next generation, and leaders in transition. You can check out our website at fambusiness.org to learn more. You can contact Brooke, Andrea, or me. So today, thanks to PretiFlaherty, we have our final program for this year in our series of online programs called Legal Lunches, where we pair up the expertise of their lawyers with a family-owned business. So this one is called People Are People, the Most Challenging Employee Personas and How to Manage Them. And I'm sure none of you have any challenging people that you work with, but we're going to help you with this. And so we have Laura Rideout, who's the partner with PretiFlaherty, and Deb Whitworth, who's the owner and CEO of HR Studio Group, LLC. Our last program of the year is next Wednesday, December 8th from 5 to 7. It's our holiday party at the Woodlands. We call it Mingle and Jingle. We haven't done that in 2 years. They have an ultrafiltration system that they told me about. We will have temperature checks, and we have maybe about 50 people who are registered now. So if you'd like to come and join us, we'll have some yummy hors d'oeuvres, and it'll be a nice holiday party. Towards the end of the program, we'll be putting a link in a survey in the chat. So please fill out that survey because this is how we build our programs. We're gathering all that information now, and we're doing a call out for people for programs for next year. And right now, I'll turn it over to Laura. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. So I think a lot of you have been, repeat attendees, and I thank you for that. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, thanks for being here. As Catherine mentioned, my name is Laura. I'm a partner at the law firm of PretiFlaherty, and I practice with my firm's labor and employment and litigation groups. And a large part of what I do in my day-to-day professional life is working with Maine businesses and advising them about how they can comply with laws that impact their workforce. And then as a litigator, I also help my clients when they need to investigate and address workplace misconduct or defend against a claim if a claim is filed. And I'm very pleased to be talking about, our topic today, which is how to effectively manage some of these problematic employee personalities or behaviors that can cause disruption in the workforce. And with that, I will turn it over to my co-presenter, Deb.
Good afternoon, everybody. Deb Whitworth. I have been in HR consulting and in human resources my entire career. For the last almost 7 years, I've owned and managed a consulting firm, HR Studio Group, based out of Portland. And it seems like I always have an investigation going on with one of my clients. And I'm currently conducting an investigation right now for a municipality in Maine. And one of the things that keeps coming up in this investigation is, do we have a hostile work environment, or do we have a toxic employment culture? And we're going to talk about the difference between the two as we go through our presentation today. One of the things that I like to tell clients, and I teach some classes at USM, one of the things that I always like people to think of as a backdrop or a framework for employment is that your goal as an employer is to identify, hire, recruit, and retain individuals who like what your business has to offer. So keep that as a framework. And I say that because even though that's what your goal is, to hire people and engage them and retain them, people who like what you have to offer, that doesn't absolve you from having people in your work environment who are difficult personality types. So let's just keep those couple things in the back of our mind as we go through our presentation today. And thank you all for being here.
So this slide gives you our roadmap for what we're hoping to cover today. We will go over some of those most common challenging workplace behaviors that tend to manifest themselves. And I'm sure, you will have your own thoughts on other categories of problematic behaviors that we do not include on our list, but, we've tried to highlight some of the most frequent examples. We'll also talk about why we should care about this. Why are we trying to address this? I think some of that is pretty obvious, but it's sort of two sides of a coin here. Part of it is just from an operational standpoint, you're going to get better results if you don't have this sort of thing happening in your workplace. And we'll talk about some data and statistics about that as well. And then on the other side of the coin, this isn't necessarily the primary driving factor, but it certainly is a relevant consideration. If we do an effective job at managing difficult employees and these problematic behaviors, then we could be saving ourselves some trouble in the long run, because we could be reducing or eliminating the circumstances and scenarios that could create liability or claims in the future. So really good to be focusing on these types of things and what kinds of practices might be happening in the workplace that are enabling these behaviors to happen and then to continue. And as Deb mentioned, we'll talk about, what the term of art hostile work environment means, and when some of these challenging behaviors or personalities can sort of cross the line from a toxic workplace, which isn't necessarily unlawful or illegal, to something that is rising to the level of illegal harassment or a hostile work environment that could give rise to liability. And then we will conclude by giving you some ideas for best practices on how to address these difficult employees and behaviors that may be happening in your workplace, and what some of the best practices are surrounding documenting the actions that you take in that regard. So if you've attended one of the legal lunches before, you know that the way we are trying to enhance audience participation in this Zoom era is to incorporate some of these poll questions. And for today's topic, Deb and I decided we might actually, instead of doing polls, do quizzes, because it could be awkward or uncomfortable to get you all to say, how many of you have a gossip in your workplace? Or, you don't necessarily want to own up to those things. So we thought we'll do quiz questions instead and use those to lay the foundation for what we want to talk about. So I'll have Brooke administer this quiz question. And basically what we're trying to get at here is how likely is it that these types of impacts in the workplace are going to be interfering with employees doing their best work? If we have an inclusive workplace culture where these behaviors are not present, how much more likely is it that our employees are going to be giving you their best work? So
I'm going to give you just a little bit of background on this. So for about the last 15 years or so, maybe 20, organizations have been talking about diversity and how important it is to have a diverse workforce, which means how do we attract and retain people who like what we have to offer that don't all look like us? So how do we find individuals of a diverse background, different ages, different ethnicities, different cultures, different generations? Not only how do we find these people and employ them, that's diversity. The inclusive part is, now that we've attracted them and they work for us, that's only half the job. The other half of the job is, how do we make them feel welcome? So the diversity part is inviting a diverse work culture, inviting people of a diverse background to join your organization. Inclusivity means now that we've got you here, we want you to feel welcome. So it's a two-pronged part of the puzzle.
Okay, and I think everybody can see the results of that quiz right now. I just tried to publish those results, and about 30% of you were correct. It's 3 times more likely to do our best work when we have an inclusive workplace culture. So what are some of these difficult personality traits that are common in the workplace? I don't think any of these will come as a surprise to you, but this is the list that stands out to me. And these are what I typically hear from clients as a source of problematic behavior and issues in the workplace. Gossiping, especially when people might be sharing private information or confidential information about their coworkers, is a huge problem. Yelling, obviously, we don't want people to be yelled at or screamed at in the workplace. The freeloader problem, Deb, I can let you speak to that one because that one was your suggestion, but that's a big one.
Yeah, so the freeloader is an individual who kind of flies under the radar and isn't necessarily somebody who is taking responsibility for their job, but is allowing other people to backfill. And the person who freeloads is freeloading on the back of other individuals who, in the face of teamwork, are getting the job of the department or the division done. And the freeloader brings down the morale of the organization or the morale of the department when people finally, coworkers, finally latch on to the fact that they're carrying this individual in the guise of teamwork. They're carrying this individual who is not being held accountable by his or her supervisor. So we want to take particular note as supervisors and managers that if we have individuals who maybe aren't holding up their end of their job, that it's our responsibility as managers and supervisors to hold all employees accountable to the work that they've signed on for.
I've seen a lot of articles on this topic recently where high-performing employees are becoming burnt out, not because of doing their job, but because then their supervisors are coming them to help when there's a crisis and something else didn't get done. And so all of a sudden there's extra time pressure and extra workload that's saddling these high performers. And that is contributing to loss of our high performers and turnover, which is obviously not ideal. And then of course, negativity, someone's always complaining about something in the workplace, whether it's substantive or not, that can be a problem as well. And one of the things I've noticed, and Deb, I don't know if you've noticed this as well, interacting with your clients, but I think it goes without saying that all of these types of behaviors can happen in any workplace. And it's a function of, people with different experience and backgrounds, different levels of emotional intelligence, and, all sorts of reasons why people might not get along, or there might be gossip, or there might be a complainer, or, what have you. But I found that in our current day and age where we're dealing with a pandemic and other environmental stressors outside of the workplace, maybe it depends on the election cycle and if there are polarizing issues happening, vaccine mandates, masks or no masks, all of that can exacerbate underlying morale issues, and I think can cause these problematic behaviors to potentially happen with more frequency.
And Laura, I have to agree with you. I think sometimes in some organizations, there's a line in the sand drawn. And regardless of what the polarizing issue is, let's just look at mask mandate versus no mask mandate, or vax versus, unvaccinated. You've got people on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, and you have complainers created on both sides, that people who, for instance, are vaccinated, fully vaccinated, are complaining about the people who aren't vaccinated, which requires more stringent guidelines in workplaces. So everybody pays the price for not everybody following following the guidelines. It doesn't even have to be pandemic related. It can be anything. So what we tend to do in organizations is write our policies for that individual or that group of individuals that are our weakest link. And we write our policies, we write our attendance policy, we write it with the thought that people aren't going to be consistently present for their jobs. Consequently, we've got those individuals who are consistently attendant in their jobs complaining about those who aren't. They have every reason to complain. You still have people on both sides, and it causes, I don't want to say hostility in the workplace, but it certainly does cause some unrest.
So one of these problematic behaviors that we wanted to highlight and give some special attention to is workplace bullying. And obviously bullying can sort of manifest many of these different challenging individual behaviors into what we refer to as bullying. But it is something that is fairly common in the workforce. And this slide has some statistics that I pulled from a workforce survey earlier this year. And you know, I was actually pretty surprised to read some of these statistics that such a high number of survey respondents were reporting that they either experience or observe bullying happening in the workplace, and that a lot of the people who are demonstrating this behavior or exhibiting these behaviors are supervisory or managerial level employees. And the fact that it is obviously contributing to turnover and it is causing adverse health impacts to happen. So potentially people taking sick leave or worse because of what's going on in the workplace. And one trend that I've seen, and Deb, I don't know if you've seen this as well, but you know, I'm seeing a lot of disability claims with a mental health component. And I'm seeing when these sort of manifest themselves as claims, there are allegations that events in the workplace were triggering these underlying mental health conditions, which creates a whole host of problems. So something to be aware of. And something else that I've learned is that, you know, whether it's because of emotional intelligence issues or other issues, oftentimes the perpetrators of the bullying aren't aware that they are doing behavior that is bullying. And, you know, I think there's a couple of reasons for that, which we can talk about. So one of the questions we get, well, what is bullying? It's a term that I think gets thrown around a lot. You know, people are quick to call something bullying, but what does that actually mean? And I've highlighted for you here some of the ways that bullying manifests itself, but in its most basic form, bullying means repeatedly mistreating somebody. You know, there's a target and there's a perpetrator, and that target is being repeatedly singled out or mistreated by this perpetrator in one of these various ways. And, you know, this can manifest itself in ways we would expect. You know, when we think about a bully, we think of somebody who's yelling and shouting or insulting you or making threats against you. We might think of verbal altercations or physical altercations. But there are also a lot of more subtle bullying behaviors that we might not necessarily think of or notice or even pay attention to. An example might be somebody, you know, somebody who's always hostile to you in email communications. Maybe they've embarrassed you in a staff meeting in front of your coworkers. Maybe they are giving you frequent criticism that is really unfair and, you know, is not being levied against coworkers. Maybe they're being isolated or excluded in the workplace. So this can sort of come up in a lot of different ways, and we're not necessarily thinking of those classic schoolyard bullying type of behaviors.
The other thing I think that's important is that if you look at your workforce or your work environment as a whole, and you're thinking about wellness relative to your work environment, you want to also kind of keep in the back of your mind that wellness is not just the absence of illness. That wellness is a state of being in your organization where something like bullying not only is not accepted, but it's addressed when it occurs. So we want to look at wellness as as something organic in an organization, and not simply, well, my organization is not ill, so that means that it's well, because that's not the case at all.
Right. And so one of the related topics is, how come these behaviors persist in a working environment? What are the maybe inherent or implicit enabling factors going on that allow it to continue? Because you would like to think if you had a supervisor doing these things, you would notice it and address it and the problem would be solved. But sometimes that doesn't happen. And there's a few reasons why. One of them is that the target might be afraid of retribution by the perpetrator if they escalate the issue to another supervisor, go over that person's head, or raise it with them directly. So they would rather suffer in silence and then find a new job and leave than raise it. So having a policy or a company culture where, people can know that they're able to come forward with concerns and that those concerns will be heard and addressed appropriately can work to eliminate that problem of fear of retribution or retaliation. And then I think the other enabling factor is if we don't hold managers and supervisors accountable and give them the training that they need and appropriately take action when these issues do come to light, there will be this culture of that type of behavior is tolerated here, that type of behavior is allowed here. And so, that can contribute to a worse problem as time goes on.
And we get a question from the audience.
Okay.
I would like to know if we can use the term bullying in an employee write-up, or if that is too vague or seen as interpretive by the person who feels bullied.
So that's a really good question. And we are going to get into specifics about how to document those types of issues. What I will say now is my advice when documenting these things is to be specific and be factual. Try to stay away from vague and generic labels and focus instead on the facts. This date, this time, this conduct happened, X, Y, and Z happened. And that way there's no room for interpretation about what that is. And we're not putting a subjective judgment or label on it that can be twisted or turned later on. If we can tie it back to a policy and say, this conduct happened and it violated X, Y, and Z policy, and maybe there's a code of conduct or a workplace harassment or bullying policy, then that would be good to do too. But like I said, we have a couple of slides devoted to this topic that we'll come back to.
I also just want to add one thing real quick, is that the EEOC, so the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has said repeatedly in their trainings, on their website, in their emails that they get out to people who subscribed to their email list, is that training, supervisory training in your organization is one of the best tools that business owners, business leaders have for equipping supervisors and managers so that they can understand what these terms mean and how to act when they're faced with an employee coming to them saying, you need to know that this is happening. We need to train managers and supervisors so that they don't listen but not hear exactly what the employee said, so that they know that they have a responsibility to take action. And we have to train them so that they know precisely what to do, because they represent the organization in their role as a manager.
I agree with that. And so, this is a topic where Deb and I were sort of talking about this as we prepared for today's presentation, that we could easily spin off this topic into a full day workshop with an hour presentation on a number of related topics. I think one of those topics we were talking about and we wanted to at least mention is the fact that cyberbullying is very common in the workplace. And I know, Deb, you had an anecdote about that.
Well, yeah, I don't remember exactly what the anecdote was, but I will tell you that in this age of Zoom and managing remote work situations, we have to pay particular attention to cyberbullying, because just because we're not in a work environment standing around the water cooler or in the break room does not mean that bullying is not a thing any longer. It's just happening in a different format. And again, we have to make sure that managers and supervisors are equipped so that they know how to deal and how to respond to behavior that's happening in the workplace, whether it's live and in person or remote, whatever the case may be. It means that we have to provide different resources for managers and supervisors so that they know precisely what their responsibilities are and how to act.
So how do we know if something is rising to the level of unlawful or illegal workplace conduct? There's this difference between behavior that is contributing to what might be a toxic workplace, but it might not be a workplace that could lead to potential liability for the employer. So how do we tell the difference between the two? And how do we know if we're crossing the line into territory where there could be illegal harassment or a hostile work environment? When does bullying equal harassment or a hostile work environment? And so it's important to keep in mind that not all, quote unquote harassment is necessarily illegal. My boss could come in here and yell at me right now, and I could say that he's discriminating against me, or that's harassment. But unless I am being targeted based on my membership in a protected class by that person, then it's not illegal. It might be poor management, it might be an indication that this is not someone who's effectively supervising me, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's illegal conduct going on. So again, harassment is unwelcome conduct. It's conduct that is based on somebody's membership in a protected class. And I've listed for you here what those protected classes are, generally speaking. And then, so that's the first part of the analysis. The second part of the analysis: when does the harassment rise to a level where it is unlawful and shouldn't be happening in the workplace? In some cases, one incident will be egregious enough where it could potentially create liability for an employer. But generally, that conduct has to be what's called severe or pervasive, so that it's creating an environment that is intimidating, hostile, or abusive. So, multiple incidents of someone being harassed on the basis of their membership in a protected class over a period of time is going to create a problem from a liability standpoint.
When you think about a toxic work culture versus a hostile work environment, one of the things that we talk about in one of the classes I teach is that it's not illegal necessarily to be just a really lousy boss. It's not illegal to have poor management skills. It's not a good thing for an organization, but that does not necessarily rise to the level of being something that you could have an employee bring a claim against the organization for.
Right. And unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily stop someone from trying to bring a claim, which, obviously there are defenses to these claims and whatnot, but trying to prevent the behavior in the first instance, whether or not it does rise to the level of illegal conduct, is only going to serve to benefit your organization.
Also think about whether or not your organization wants to be one that is proactive or reactive. So at some point, you are going to have to deal with inappropriate workplace behaviors. And you can either do that as an organization proactively by hiring the right people for the right jobs, hiring people with good supervisory skills, providing supervisory and management training. You can either be proactive and do it that way, or you can be reactive and have to hire an attorney to defend a discrimination claim. So decide on the kind of organization that you want to be, and then work toward, hopefully, being proactive and putting resources toward building a work environment that is not only not hostile, but is not toxic either.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is, even if you choose not to take the proactive approach and be reactive, it's still really important to have that foundation, because it's easier for us to defend those claims if we can point to all of the things that are being done to detect and prevent and correct inappropriate behavior that might be unlawful harassment. If there isn't a policy and if there wasn't any orientation and if there weren't any of these pieces that exist to help correct that behavior when it comes to light or prevent it in the first instance, then those claims are more challenging for us to defend. So this next slide highlights for you some of the laws that provide protection against harassment. We won't spend a lot of time here, but this is sort of just a reference point. So you're sort of aware of the state and federal laws that come into play. Civil rights laws and the Americans with Disabilities Act being some of the primary examples here. And that leads us into our next question. So our next quiz question. So for these quiz questions, I am going to read the question because once the quiz prompt comes up, my understanding is you might not be able to see that anymore. So I'll have Brooke administer this quiz. And the question is, or the prompt, the scenario is, Tim Smith wears a back brace due to a medical condition. His coworker Tina makes fun of Tim behind his back because his brace causes him to walk with a limp. Another coworker, Todd, knocked Tim's stack of papers on the floor as he walked past Tim's workstation, knowing that Tim would struggle to bend over and collect them. So the question is this scenario bullying or is this scenario harassment? Okay, let's go ahead and publish those poll results. So 65% said that this is bullying and 35% said this is harassment. And I'm gonna say the 35% has it on this one. So some of the factors that stand out in this scenario that tips the scales towards unlawful harassment as opposed to just, straight bullying would be that this is an individual that has a medical condition. He's wearing a back brace. And he's apparently been targeted by, two different coworkers on two different occasions in connection with that disability. So that's something that looks like it could potentially be an unlawful harassment situation. Let's do the next one. Oops, I skipped it. All right, I think I'm back where I need to be. So Brooke, if you can administer this one. So this scenario is Sam Smith manages the accounting department and sends nasty emails to his employee, Kyle Spencer. Sam blames Kyle for the backlog in the department and threatens to demote him or fire him if the department does not meet its goals. Sam glares at Kyle in staff meetings and makes fun of questions that Kyle is asking. What do we think about this one? Okay, Brooke, why don't we go ahead and publish these results? So this time we have an 87%, 13% split, and this time the 87% has it. There's nothing in this scenario that is suggesting to us that Kyle, who is the target, is a member of a protected class. It looks like he has just a bad supervisor who's engaging in some of those toxic and problematic behaviors that aren't really effective. So we've kind of already touched upon why we care about this and why we do want to address and correct these behaviors. Really, there's two reasons. It's going to decrease productivity, morale, work quality, engagement. It's going to make people less satisfied with their job. And it could also impact your company's reputation. If your clients become aware of it, they might not want to do business with you anymore if they have a negative experience with one of your employees or one of your supervisors. Or, if, they're talking with someone who's had a negative experience, that's just not a good thing. And then it also is going to increase some problems for you. Like I said earlier, you might have employees who are taking sick leave because of this, experiencing mental health issues, filing disability claims, or potentially pursuing a lawsuit. So there are many, many reasons why we want to be trying to identify these problems and correcting them when they're happening. So we're on our next quiz question now. Brooke, if you could pull this one up. How many people are voluntarily choosing to leave their job? And this data is from 2019 that we're relying on for this poll. Okay, Brooke, can you publish those results? So kind of equal responses in the 20, 25, and 30% ranges.
And the answer is 20%. I would venture to wonder what that percentage would be in 2020 or in even the first half of 2021, because I'm sure that many of you are reading about the Great Resignation and people who left their jobs due to the pandemic, not wanting to return to any job. Even though we're not post-pandemic, but many organizations have gone back to being in person rather than strictly remote, as we were for much of 2020 in non-essential jobs. So 20% in 2019 is likely to look much different in 2020.
So when that happens and somebody leaves, how much is that costing the organization? And I'll let Deb speak to this one because she pulled this data from her research. But I can see this as another case where that number could fluctuate. If you have somebody who's in a specialized job and has received a lot of, training or mentorship, it could potentially be a lot more expensive to replace that person if they chose to leave.
So we're looking at percentages here. And, oh gosh, pretty much split between 10,000 and 17,500, and the answer is 10,000. So about 20% per year for somebody earning $50,000 a year. If you go up in hierarchy in an organization, that number continues to escalate. So if you have a senior leader or a C-suite individual who leaves their organization, the cost is much higher than 20%. It is as high as 50 to 75% of annual earnings, because you take into consideration not just lost productivity, but you take into consideration recruitment, hiring, orientation, onboarding, training. You take all of that into consideration for somebody at a high level in an organization, and you're looking at least 50% of that individual's annual salary. So the cost of turnover is something to be reckoned with in organizations. It's much less costly to do the right thing, create an inclusive work culture, an environment that is not toxic, but a culture of excellence, where you're not constantly dealing with a revolving door at any level in the organization.
I think there's probably some intangibles here too. Like, if somebody leaves and there's a vacancy for a period of time, maybe it's a week, maybe it's 3 months, then that probably is impacting the coworkers who are then trying to pick up extra shifts or cover that workload in the interim period. So I can see this as impacting the organization in so many ways, in addition to the bottom line impact that we're talking about here. So how do we deal with it? What can we be doing proactively to address these problems and to help us in the event that we were going to face a claim later on down the road arising from this behavior that might cross the line into something that looks like it could be unlawful harassment or a hostile work environment? And as Deb mentioned, as I've mentioned, training is really critical here. And we don't want to be focusing on just, we want to be looking at all experience bands and training as appropriate about what expectations are and what the company culture is supposed to be. I find it really helpful when my clients have a code of conduct that spells out some of the behavior that isn't appropriate, because then it's really a lot easier when you're addressing it with someone to point to the expectation in the policy document and cite to that in the documentation and have something to refer to. It takes some of that subjective judgment out of it. Who's going to decide what behavior is okay and what behavior isn't okay? And some of it will be black and white, and there might be some gray areas there. So having some guidelines in place can be really helpful. And then something I've seen a lot, it depends on the industry, but there is an immigrant population in our state. There are people with different levels of education and backgrounds and socioeconomic status that are working in the same work environment sometimes. And this can lead to some differences of opinion and challenges in working together. And so basic things like civility, business etiquette, cultural sensitivity, diversity training, inclusion awareness training, and something that Deb and I both feel very strongly about is unconscious bias training. And I can let Deb speak to that a little bit.
Right. The first time that I did unconscious bias training was probably about, maybe 7-8 years ago. And it was a really interesting program to put together because in the training program, managers and supervisors were able to uncover through the workshop their own biases, which they weren't fully aware of. That's why we say it's unconscious bias. I don't think anybody goes to work in the morning or gets up in the morning and says, oh gosh, I want to be biased today. Nobody has that as a goal because it's unconscious. We don't realize it. We don't understand it. And having managers particularly and supervisors go through unconscious bias training, which includes some elements of cultural sensitivity, diversity, and inclusion awareness, really helps managers and supervisors, as we have up in the third bullet, understand their own flaws. Understanding your weaknesses is really the only way that you'll be able to turn yourself around and admit where you have opportunities for learning and for changing your behavior. But it's only through this appropriate training that you really have an opportunity to question your own self and make changes in your own behavior. And I think Catherine said that somebody had a question.
We do have a question. Yep.
Okay.
How has working from home policy and best practices adapted during the pandemic era? What should our organizations be doing?
That's a great question. I'll take a stab at it first. I think it's clear that there are definitely some professions where remote work is likely not a possibility. So, a first responder, a firefighter, a healthcare practitioner, many of those positions typically are not able to be done remotely. Although some healthcare practitioners can do telehealth, and they've been very successful in, helping to migrate to that kind of a platform. I think we're in a really interesting phase of work right now where the world of work has changed, and where the pandemic sent a lot of people home to work remotely. We have workers who have said, you know what, I kind of like that. I kind of like being able to run my dog out at 10 o'clock in the morning. And my dog really kind of likes it too. And so people are now reluctant, not all people, but many people from what I've been reading and from working with my clients, we have employees who are reluctant to want to go back to the 9 to 5, an hour commute in the morning, an hour commute in the afternoon, buying work clothes, buying lunch every day. And what's happened is that people are realizing they can do with less. So if I work remotely, I don't need as much stuff in order to work. I might be able to just have one car in my family instead of two. So I think the world of work for some professions has really changed, and employers who are, I don't even want to say reluctant, but who are not addressing the world of work and its changes are the ones who are losing potentially very good workers. And I think we have to admit that the world of work has changed, and what can we do to adapt as an employer? I don't know what you're seeing, Laura, but that's what I'm seeing with individuals and companies that I work with.
I don't know if my reactions to that question are exactly on point, but a couple of the things that I've dealt with, in the recent past include, and I think we sort of alluded to this earlier, I've seen sort of a drop in formalities happen to some extent when people are working from home. They might be a little more collegial, a little less professional in some circumstances, and that when they're returning back to the workplace are carrying some of that casualness with them. Some of it's good, but some of it is potentially bad. And I've also seen some problematic behaviors emerge because of the casualness of, working remotely and using video conferencing as opposed to in-person meetings. I read about a case where there was a sexual harassment claim that arose out of a supervisor having an unmade bed behind him, and because he did his Zoom meetings in his bedroom with an unmade bed behind him, and comments were made about the unmade bed. And you can sort of use your imagination to figure out where those conversations could go and how that could potentially make somebody uncomfortable. But there are all sorts of ways that the changing nature of the workplace and how things are done could lead to problems later on down the road. So, it's definitely something to keep your finger on the pulse of and be sensitive to and adapting policies going forward. And then a related question that comes up is, well, what if some of my employees want to work remotely and others, and I'm willing to allow some of them to, but not others? How do I make those decisions, and how do I make it fair? And I've worked with a lot of clients on crafting policies that can be used on a case-by-case basis to make those decisions and to have objective criteria laid out so that people understand that they're being treated fairly and held to the same standards. And some jobs and personality types work fine for continued working remotely, and some would be an utter disaster. And so how do you make those calls and avoid people feeling resentful or jealous of their coworkers in those circumstances?
We have another question too. Any advice when a workplace requires everyone to wear a face mask, whether they are vaccinated or not, and an employee had COVID and felt they should not have to wear a face mask for a 90-day window?
Can you say that one again, Catherine?
Okay. Any advice when a workplace requires everyone to wear a face mask, whether they are vaccinated or not, an employee had COVID and felt they should not have to wear a face mask for a 90-day window? So they want an exemption because they've had COVID and they don't think they need it when everybody else is wearing the face mask.
They have that quote unquote natural immunity following a positive COVID result. That's a really good question. I think that's I think there's a number of reasons why you would enforce that policy anyway, even though that person might not be posing a health risk. First of all, if that person is exempted from the policy and everyone else is expected to follow it, then, you know, then people are going to ask questions and wonder why. And then
Right.
you can't divulge confidential medical information about employees. So that's creating a big headache for you because people are getting upset. Why is that person excluded and I have to follow it? And you can't explain why. And so you have a festering problem with no good solution. Whereas if you hold everyone to the standard, that is completely avoided. And that's
And
why
everyone means everyone.
Right.
Everyone, I mean, if you're vaccinated and you've got your booster and you're fully vaccinated, you're not any different from anybody else. So everybody wears a mask, bottom line.
Okay, we have about 6 minutes, ladies.
Okay.
Okay, so let's get to our next slide then. So, you know, we talked about some of these strategies for dealing with toxic employees. Training is really important. And then where Deb left off was talking about, you know, how you can sort of get supervisors to understand their own shortcomings potentially. And I'm reminded of something that Dottie and I covered in a legal lunch earlier this year. She described how a 360-degree performance assessment was a really good tool to help understand, you know, strengths and weaknesses as a leader. So there are all sorts of tools like that that are available to help people understand where they might be falling short and then have a path forward to improve. So one of the things we want to be sort of ensuring that's happening if we are addressing these problematic work behaviors is that we actually document it and put it in the personnel file. If we don't document it and if it doesn't end up in the personnel file, then it's almost like it never even happened. It's really important if there ever is a claim to be able to support the legitimate and non-discriminatory reason for a termination. A lot of times I'll have, you know, clients say, well, it's an at-will state. I can fire someone for any reason I want or no reason. And that's true, but you can't fire someone for an illegal reason. And there is a burden shifting legal standard, and there is a burden on an employer to prove that there was a legitimate and non-discriminatory reason for the termination. And then the burden shifts back to the plaintiff, and, you know, going over that whole standard is a topic for another day. But suffice it to say, the employer does want to be able to show that there are contemporaneous pieces of evidence that support the reason that termination decision was made. And so some of the mistakes we see are vague and unclear statements about why someone was disciplined or terminated. We talked earlier about being factual and being specific. So dates, times, people involved, what was the exact conduct that was a problem. And we want to avoid subjective impressions or judgments about the scenario and kind of stick to the facts. We don't want to be padding the file to support a decision after the fact. We want to be doing this contemporaneously. And that's not only to protect against liability, but it's also the most effective way to actually address these problems, which is our #1 goal. And so we want to be documenting it. We want to be taking appropriate action. And then the job isn't done. You know, we don't pat ourselves on the back and say, okay, well, we put a written warning in the file, problem solved, on to the next issue. We have to follow up with that person and make sure that they're accountable and they actually did improve. And in that documentation, we need to show, here's what the expectation is, and here's what needs to happen for improvement. And if it doesn't happen, here's the consequence of that. So the employee is on notice, the process is fair, and we have the best opportunity for success in changing the problematic behavior. We always want to assume that somebody is going to be reading this documentation. You know, I'll see examples where supervisors will email their boss and just vent about their subordinate employees. And they'll make some legitimate performance-based or behavior-based complaints, but then they might have a whole bunch of unprofessional comments strewn in there. And we kind of want to stay away from that. And that's why some of that supervisor and manager training could be really important. Deb, anything you want to add there, or, you know, things that you've seen that didn't work very well?
Well, yes, I actually had a situation yesterday where somebody wanted to put something in an employee's personnel file, but the employee wasn't aware of it. And it was because the manager didn't want to confront the employee with the behavior, but wanted it noted in the personnel file. And I said, well, we're not just putting random documents in an employee's personnel file. They have access to everything in the file, and they need to be aware of what's in the file. And not only will you have a discussion with the employee before you slip it in their file, but you will also have the employee at least initial, preferably sign the documentation indicating that that they're aware of it, and that they've had an opportunity to make comments on the documentation. So just putting something in the personnel file randomly doesn't really count. The employee has to be aware of it, and the best way to make sure they're aware of it is that they've signed it or initialed it.
I agree with that. And also making sure that, you know, all of your departments are aware of what forms exist, what the disciplinary action policy is. Maybe you have progressive discipline, and making sure things are being done consistently across the organization is also really helpful. And with that, we've taken you right to 1 p.m. Thank you for the great questions throughout the presentation. I'm happy to answer additional questions. I know some of these questions might be sensitive and you might not want to ask them in front of a whole group of people. I'm happy to field any email questions, or feel free to give me a call if there's anything else you want to talk about.
Same here. Don't hesitate to be in touch.
And we'll provide that information when we send the recap with their contact information. We've also put our survey in. If you could please let us know what you think about this program, that would be great in the chat. And we'll stay on for a few minutes so that you can reach out to that. We'll also send it in our follow-up survey. I want to thank our sponsors, PretiFlaherty and Main Biz. And I also want to thank Laura and Deb for fabulous speakers. And we hope you'll join us next Wednesday for our holiday party at the Woodland. And we will have a whole new slate of programs coming up in 2022, so you can stay tuned for that. And we hope you have a great day, and just thank everyone for this, and happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Merry Christmas.
Thank
Thank you.
You too.